Okay, welcome. We're going to talk about printmaking today. I'm recording it. Why do you have to record me? But you're here. Okay. There are two main kinds of print. There's relief printing and intaglio. Okay, in relief printing, this will all be on the quiz. Sure. Why not give you a quiz and then you'll get 100 and you can bring your grades up. Okay. Okay. In a relief print, and you're familiar with this if you ever did linoleum block printing. So you get a block of something. This is the same with the wood cut. And you cut away these areas and you leave these areas. This is a side view of the print. And then you take what's called a brayer, which is a roller, and you roll across the top of this surface with the roller, and you deposit ink on the little areas in between the areas that you've cut into. And then you put a piece of paper on it, and whatever you didn't cut turns into a line on the print or a dark area on the print. And if you remember doing a linoleum print, it's sort of a pain because just to make one simple line, you have to cut on either side of it. Like all the white area, you have to cut away all the white area. So it's not very natural. We're used to thinking of drawing in terms of laying down a dark line, not drawing in terms of subtracting dark. You know, it's like if you've ever made a drawing on black paper with white charcoal. It's the same thing. It's like everything's backwards. It doesn't feel very natural. Intaglio is much more natural because in intaglio you have a flat surface and you cut into that surface one way or another. You create indents in that surface, and then you have to spread ink over the entire thing and push the ink down into these little indents that you made. And finally, you have to go through the most laborious part of the process. You then have to wipe off all the ink from the smooth surface of the plate, leaving behind the ink in these little depressions. Then, because you notice that the ink doesn't go all the way to the surface, so then what you have to do is you have to soak some paper in water to get it damp. You lay the damp paper down on top of that plate so the fibers of the paper are all swollen, and that's where you need a printing press to roll the plate and the paper together under high pressure. And what happens is the paper gets forced down into those lines and it picks up the ink that's in the lines. So process of printing intaglio is a little more laborious. The process of making the prints, though, is very easy and natural. Okay, so we're going to do intaglio, and there's really three main types of intaglio. One is engraving, and one is etching, and the last one is dry point. So these are three different ways of basically scratching lines into an etching plate, which could be either metal or plastic. Engravers use engraving tools to cut V-shaped, very clean V-shaped lines into the plate. Remember, this is a side view, so this is like the shape of the cut. I know. So the engraver has to use very sharp tools, and engravers traditionally worked on metal plates, and it's a lot of work. You have to really think about it. You're basically chiseling a line into metal by hand. It's very hard. Yep. So in etching, you take a metal plate, it has to be metal, and you coat it with this greasy stuff. It's called a resist. It's almost like a thin layer of waxy tar that you melt onto it. Okay? Everybody grasp that idea? That this is called the resist. Resist. And then you draw on that with a sharp tool. It's basically like a needle point. And you cut away the resist. And you can draw very freely on that because you're just like scratching through this very soft material. It cuts like butter. It's just like draw away on it. And then when we hear the word etching, we associate that with acid. And that's because what you have to do with it then is you take this whole plate, you put it into an acid bath, and the corrosion of the acid eats away the metal wherever your lines were drawn, like this. So you end up with the same effect as an engraving, but with much less work. And this can also, remember, we're talking in every case about printing intaglio style. So you can print intaglio with this type of line or with this type of line. It prints almost the same. Finally, dry point is often thought of as a type of etching, but it's a little different. In dry point, you just use a little more pressure than etching and a sharper tool. And what you're doing is, here's the plate. You don't use a resist. You just drag that sharp tool across the surface, and because you're not removing any material, engraving and etching are both removing material. You know, your engraver's tool is going to leave little thin fragments of metal, and the etching is going to carry that metal away in the acid bath. In dry point, you're not removing material, you're just pushing it around. So you're basically, it's called raising a burr. So as you drag the material, drag your tool across this plastic or metal, you raise a burr on either side of the line, like that. And then when you ink it, the ink goes into these little valleys, and then when you wipe it, it stays there. So the advantage of dry point is it's the easiest kind of intaglio print to create. The disadvantage is that a dry point plate won't last more than a few impressions, because when you take that plate and roll it under the high pressure of the printing press, it's going to subtly flatten down this burr. And once the burr is gone, you don't have very much left to hold the ink, because you haven't really scratched very deep into the actual material. Having said that, it still creates beautiful effects. And you can get a few good prints on plastic, and you can get a lot more on metal. We're going to do plastic. This is an actual dry point plate that Jane Scheiber did a few years ago. Let me put it on a white background so you can see it better. There's a little bit, she printed with blue ink, so you can see a little bit of blue in the lines. And I'm going to pass this around so you can touch it. But you can see it, it looks like she did hardly anything at all. She took a piece of plastic and just lightly drew this design on it. She drew the design on paper first, taped this down on top of the paper. This is how it looks from the front. Like if I'm touching this, this is where it's raised. This is how it looks the other way. And I'm going to show you the final print that came out of that plate was like that. So I think this actually won an award at Shoreline. It was like, it's a really fine print, I think. And the difference between that and this is that she made some more creative decisions while she was doing the process of inking and wiping. And that's the last thing I want to explain, which is that you spread that layer of ink over the entire plate, and then you wipe it off to bring your lines out. What Jane did was she left some of the, it's called plate tone, on the plate. She didn't wipe it completely, and she made a creative choice to wipe it more where the lines were and to leave this kind of vignetting effect of blue around the outside. And honestly, without that effect, it would be a pretty boring print. It's like, that really calls attention to the hands, and I think it's a very successful effect. So the exciting and sort of nerve-wracking thing about dry point is that you can experiment with effects like this, but at the same time, you only have you're only going to get 5 or 6 good impressions from it. So you have like 5 or 6 times to get it right and to get exactly what you want out of it. But the good news is, printmaking used to have a function of reproduction, right? Like the only way you could make more than one of something was to use a printing press and print it. We don't have that problem anymore, right? We are the most reproducible society that ever existed. We can make copies of everything and put it on the internet, and it's there forever. So if you create one great print with just the right amount of plate, like a print like this one, you can then put that in your portfolio, you can show it on the internet, and you don't need to make 100 of them for people to enjoy it. So so that's kind of an introduction. I'm going to show you very briefly what it looks like to use the tools. Here's like a scrap of plastic, and this is a dry point needle, and it has a very sharp tip, and the way you use it is you just scratch into the plastic like this. And I will pass this around too, and I'm going to let everybody try this. But there's one or two additional points I want to make. For one thing, you don't make a darker line by pressing harder. If you want a line to be darker, I don't know if Jane did any on this one, but if you want the line to be darker, you just have to go over it more times. So you're creating like a little tangle, like a little series of lines. The other thing is, so you're not pressing really hard for a dark line. If you press really lightly, you will make a lighter line. You can do that, but pressing really hard isn't going to make a really dark line. You just have to make a bunch of them like that. Another thing is, let me see. You do not ever want to have the angle of the tool at an oblique angle to the plastic like this. We're going to learn to always hold the tool pretty much straight up and down. So this is the basic technique that you want to use when you're using this tool. And it feels a little awkward at first, but you will get used to it. And you'll also notice that these lines that I'm making right now they're very hard to see, but if you put them against a dark background, they show up as white. So after you've transferred your main outlines onto your plate, if you want to do additional hatching like I'm doing right now, you just want to do it on a dark surface so you can pretty much see what you're doing. See, that's fairly visible. I can see it better in real life than it's showing up on the screen. And the final point is that you're in the beginning, you're not gonna be doing enough hatching. just hatch a lot more than you think you need to. If to get anything close to black with this technique, you got to go over it a whole bunch of times. Okay, so don't be afraid to just really work it like that, and that's finally going to create a really dark tone. But if you just do that, that's going to be an extremely light tone. It's barely going to show up. Okay, so I'm going to let you play with the tools for a little while, and then once you come up with your design, I'm going to cut the plastic the right shape, and then you can etch it, and we can try printing and see how you like it. Okay, thanks a lot.